If there's anything Mr. Wolfe dislikes more than being interrupted during his morning orchid tending, it's being interrupted by Fritz, unless, of course, Fritz is carrying a tray of beer and bratwurst. Unfortunately for all parties involved this morning, Fritz had neither tray nor smile. What he had was a furrow between his brows and a pair of feet planted firmly outside the door to the plant rooms, which is never a good sign. I had just finished skimming the morning mail. The usual suspects were present: 2 advertising circulars, a bill from Mr. Kramer's least favourite dry cleaner, and a new mystery novel from a publisher that seemed to think Wolfe's name ought to be on the jacket. I was about to toss the lot onto Wolfe's desk when Fritz cleared his throat in that way that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, preferably boiling veal stock. "Yes," I said, without looking up. "There is a woman downstairs," he said, in a tone that indicated this was not a social visit. "She says she must speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately." I raised an eyebrow. "She say why?" "She has a jar," Fritz said, as though the object in question were made of nitroglycerin. A jar, he confirmed, "of jam. Now I've had strange things brought to the door of that brownstone, a baby goat once, on a dare, a brick wrapped in tinsel from someone who didn't like Wolfe's opinion on civic reform, even a man carrying half a cello. But a jar of jam with urgency attached? That was new. She says it belonged to her brother," Fritz continued, voice low, "who is now dead." That got my attention. I glanced down the hall. She asked for Wolfe by name? She did. "Well," I said, standing, "either she's delusional, or she's got something we can spread across toast and truth. Let's see which." Fritz's eyes flicked toward the stairs. "She is persistent." "Good. That's the only kind who get past the vestibule." I met her at the foot of the stairs. She was tallish, late 30s, with the kind of posture that suggested an education and a reluctance to be here. Her coat was expensive, or had been once, and her eyes had the tight look of someone who'd been bracing for days and was starting to feel the cracks. In both hands she held a brown paper parcel. "Miss Broach?" I asked. "Miriam Broach," she corrected, voice clipped. "Mr. Goodwin?" "At your service." I gestured toward the office. "He doesn't take walk-ins, but since you've arrived bearing preserves and death, you've piqued our curiosity. This way." She entered the office with a kind of careful defiance, as though expecting ridicule and preparing to ignore it. Wolfe, of course, did not rise. He was seated at his desk, yellow pajamas still visible at the cuffs, his eyes half-lidded in mild irritation. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "Miss Miriam Broach, with a proposition and a jam jar." "I am not fond of preserves," Wolfe said, "nor propositions that arrive uninvited." She did not blink. "My brother is dead. The police said it was an accident. I believe it was murder." "Belief is insufficient," Wolfe said flatly. "Evidence is better. What of the jar?" Without a word, she placed the parcel on his desk, unwrapped it with careful hands, and revealed a sealed glass jar, blackberry jam, if my grocery store training served. What didn't serve was the sight of something dark just below the glass line, inside the jar, a single bloody fingerprint. "He hated jam," she said quietly. "He never ate it. And this was on his kitchen counter the night he died." I felt Wolfe shift, barely, but shift he did. His eyes opened fully. "You are certain the seal is intact?" he asked. She nodded. "I haven't touched it. The blood, it's not his." "And why?" he said slowly. "Did you bring it here?" "Because I want the man who put it there to explain how it got there, and what he did to my brother." Wolfe stared at the jar with the same expression he once reserved for a batch of orchids suspected of aphid infiltration. Curious, displeased, and faintly insulted. "You are aware," he said at last, "that I do not leave this house." "I read about you," she replied. "You solve problems from here? I brought the problem to you." I gave her a mental point for strategy. She met Wolfe's gaze without blinking. That alone was worth the price of admission. Wolfe sighed. Your brother's name? Tobias Broach. He worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was a conservator. And his death? 2 nights ago, the coroner called it an accident. He slipped in his apartment, but the jar wasn't his. He didn't eat jam. And the print? He would have noticed a fingerprint in the jam. He noticed everything. Wolfe tapped the jar gently with a pencil. There is blood, yet the seal is unbroken. Yes, she said. I want to know how. He sat back, steepling his fingers. You have succeeded, Miss Broach. I am intrigued. And, just like that, the hook had found its fish. Wolfe didn't move, but the chase had begun. Wolfe had spoken exactly 9 words to me after Miss Broach left. You will begin at the apartment. Today. It wasn't exactly a command, it was a pronouncement, the way one might suggest the sun should rise at dawn or Fritz should not put parsley on Wolfe's eggs. And so I went. Tobias Broach's apartment was in a modest but respectable brownstone just off Bleecker, a 2nd-floor walk-up with crown moulding and an overstuffed mailbox. The police had already combed through, but Miriam had provided me with a spare key and a written assurance from the building manager that I was permitted to recover personal effects. Wolfe, naturally, found the phrase amusing. The apartment was neat, painfully so. Books on Roman history arranged not alphabetically but by period. A single framed photo of what I assumed was Tobias and Miriam in younger years, both looking too serious for the occasion. And on the kitchen counter, in the exact spot she'd described, stood another jar of jam. This one, however, was pristine. Factory sealed, same brand, same flavour, blackberry, but no blood, no print, and no drama. The refrigerator was nearly empty, save for a half-used container of mustard and a bottle of mineral water. No signs of a jam lover's hidden stash. I opened a cabinet and found one more jar, again unopened. My gut did a little twist. A man who never touched jam had 2 jars in his kitchen and was murdered next to a 3rd, altered one. Either Tobias had become a secret hoarder of berries and sugar, or someone had planted that jar for effect. In the bedroom, a drawer filled with glass-cleaning cloths and cotton gloves made it clear. Tobias handled fragile things with ritualistic care. Anything placed in that apartment would have been noticed immediately, unless it was left after his death. Which raised another question, one I didn't yet have the shape of. I closed the cabinet slowly, thinking, if the original jar wasn't his, who wanted us to believe it was? Before heading back, I decided to poke at the edges. The landlord lived downstairs, a wiry old man named Mr. Kern, who smelled of pipe smoke and wood polish. He opened the door with a suspicious glance and softened slightly when I explained I was working for Tobias's sister. Sad business, he said, motioning me in. Didn't know him well, quiet type, paid rent on time. I nodded toward the ceiling. You hear anything unusual that night? He scratched his cheek. Now that you mention it, yeah. Thought I heard arguing. Late, close to midnight. I figured it was the radio, but the voice wasn't his. He had this kind of careful way of talking, you know. The voice I heard, deeper, angrier. Male? Oh, yes. Catch any words? He frowned. Just fragments. You think you're clever, something like that. Then a bang, like something fell. I got up, but it went quiet. Next day I heard. He trailed off, shook his head. That's useful, I said, standing. You didn't mention this to the police? They said it was an accident. I figured I imagined it. Don't want to get involved. Congratulations, I said. You're now officially involved. As I left, I made a mental note to check the coroner's timeline. If Tobias was already dead by midnight, someone was putting on a performance. If he wasn't, someone left in a hurry and forgot to clean up their fingerprints. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is not the kind of place where people break down crying in corners, unless, I suppose, you've just spilled a Greek vase. So I expected civility when I arrived at the Department of Conservation. What I got was Dorian Clabb. He was in his late 20s, rail-thin, and had the look of someone who'd slept in his shirt and regretted it. His handshake was dry and brief, his eyes darting toward the hallway, even as he invited me in. "You were Mr. Broach's assistant?" I asked, as I took a seat beside a display of half-cleaned bronze figurines. "I worked under him, yes, technically." He cleared his throat. "We collaborated on restorations." "Such as?" He gestured to a file drawer. "Mostly late Roman. There's a mosaic series being catalogued now, and he was lead conservator on the Sibylline glass amphora project. Controversial piece. Some say it's not authentic." His voice trembled slightly, not enough to scream guilt, but enough to suggest someone had been sleeping poorly. "You were close?" He looked surprised. "He was intense, but brilliant. Not warm. Still, I respected him." "Did he seem concerned about anything recently?" A pause. "Yes. But he wouldn't say what. Only that he was preparing something." He blinked quickly. "He said it would come out one way or another." "Did anyone visit him here? Unusual names?" Dorian shifted. "Jared Malloy stopped by a few times. They argued once. Mr. Broach asked me to step out during it." "Why argue with a donor?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, too quickly. But afterward, Tobias was quiet, and he started taking work home. As I walked away, I had the odd sense that Dorian Clabb knew more than he was saying, but whatever it was, he was too scared to hold it for long. Back in the office that evening, I recited my findings like a choirboy reporting to the bishop. Wolfe, as expected, remained immobile in his chair with his fingertips pressed together, listening as if I were explaining how apples fall from trees. "A duplicate jar, same brand and seal, found in the kitchen," I said. "Another in the cabinet, both untouched." "Jam," Wolfe muttered, "everywhere and nowhere." "That's poetic," I said. "But what's not poetic is the landlord downstairs. He says he heard Tobias arguing with a man around midnight. A man with a lower register and a temper, which, if you believe the coroner's estimate of death at 10:30, makes it either a ghost or a performance for witnesses." Wolfe didn't blink. "Continue." "At the museum I met Dorian Clabb, nervous, smart, and terrified of his own shadow. He all but spilled his tea when I asked about Jared Malloy. Said Tobias and Malloy had words, privately. And afterward, Tobias started working from home and said he was preparing something." Now Wolfe opened his eyes fully. "That in our world is the equivalent of slamming both fists on the desk." "He also mentioned the Sibylline glass amphora," I added. Apparently Tobias was head conservator on its restoration. Clabb suggested there were whispers about it not being entirely genuine. Wolfe's fingers pressed harder together. "So," I concluded, "Tobias had a problem artifact, a powerful donor breathing down his neck, and enough jam in his kitchen to sweeten a bakery." "Mr. Malloy's involvement in a disputed acquisition," Wolfe said slowly, "combined with a forensic curiosity, a sealed jar containing a bloody print, invites one conclusion. Someone attempted to discredit Mr. Broach posthumously, but with inelegant haste." "And did it badly?" I said. "Yes," he nodded. "So badly that it suggests Mr. Broach left a message." That evening, Wolfe made a phone call. No theatrics, no fanfare, just a simple request: "Come in the morning." I required discretion and speed. The recipient, naturally, was Saul Panzer. If you ever need a man to find the cracks in a diamond without leaving a mark, Saul's your man. He showed up the next day in his usual grey suit and with his usual lack of small talk. Wolfe handed him a single slip of paper with 3 names: Tobias Broach, Jared Malloy, and a New York-based antiquities dealer named Ari Falcone. "Mr. Panzer," Wolfe said, "I need the following: recent banking activity, unregistered cash purchases, and any discrete shipments or rentals tied to these names, particularly any storage units or safe deposit boxes." Saul nodded. "Timeline?" "Yesterday, if you please." Saul was gone in under 5 minutes. Wolfe turned back to me. "Until we know where Mr. Broach hid his aces, we do not move. He anticipated foul play. The question is whether he also anticipated the consequences." And if he did? I asked. Wolfe leaned back. Then we are not investigating a murder, we are finishing a design. That afternoon, Miriam Broach returned, carrying a leather briefcase with the same care you might reserve for an urn. Fritz led her in, and I offered her a seat. "This was in my brother's closet," she said, placing it gently on the desk. "He'd want you to have it." I opened it. Inside were half a dozen sketchbooks, an archival folder of photos, and a series of handwritten notes, each page neat, tightly spaced, and annotated in red ink. Tobias had the kind of handwriting that suggested either genius or madness, possibly both. The sketches were obsessively detailed, not just artistic renderings of Roman glass, but structural breakdowns, notations on stress fractures, historical variances in curvature, even minute shifts in hue under ultraviolet light. "He told me once," Miriam said, "that ancient glass spoke its own language, that to understand it, you had to listen through centuries of silence." I glanced at Wolfe. He was no longer merely watching, he was absorbing. His fingers hovered over the sketches as if they might scald him. "What's this?" I asked, pulling out a photo of a bronze amphora mid-restoration. "That's the Sibylline glass," Miriam said. "It was the last piece he worked on." The photo showed something odd, a clean break in the neck of the amphora. Beside it, another photo, post-restoration, revealed a seamless join. Tobias had documented the fracture, the reassembly, and the original contents which, according to a typed note, were not consistent with Roman provincial manufacturing. Wolfe took a long breath through his nose. "Miss Broach, your brother was not merely a conservator. He was a scholar, and a dangerously meticulous one." Miriam's voice dropped. "He told me he found a lie, and he was going to expose it." Late that night, Wolfe did not retire to his orchid room as usual. He sat in the office under dim light, the jam jar perched before him like an oracle. I was reading Tobias's final notebook when Wolfe finally spoke. "There is no known method by which a bloody fingerprint can appear inside a sealed jar," he said, "which leads to only two possibilities. Either the laws of containment have changed, or the print was planted." I closed the notebook. "Meaning what? Someone forced the seal back on after inserting the print?" The seal is intact, unbroken, observe." He rotated the jar slowly under the desk lamp. "No stress marks, no air leakage. The print is inside, but the jam was never breached." "That's a trick Houdini would envy." "Hardly," he said. "It is chemistry, not magic. I suspect Mr. Broach found a way to transfer a lifted print using resin, possibly from the Roman amphora, and embed it inside the jar as a posthumous accusation. And the blood?" Wolfe lifted his eyebrows. "Unknown, but not Mr. Broach's, if Miriam is correct." "If he planted the print," I said slowly, "he knew someone was coming." "Precisely." Wolfe tapped the jar with his index finger, twice. "The man who killed Tobias Broach did not know that his victim had already crafted his own indictment." "Then why the jar? Why jam?" "Because," Wolfe said with rare softness, "jam is domestic, familiar, innocuous. The killer wouldn't question it. But in the hands of a man who worked with ancient glass, it became something else." I stood. "A message." Wolfe nodded. "Not for the killer, for us." The following morning, Saul returned. He didn't knock, he never does. He simply appeared in the doorway with the faint smell of subway dust and the faint glint of information well earned. Wolfe gestured to the chair without a word. Saul sat, reached into his jacket, and produced a folded slip of paper. "Storage unit, registered under the alias A. Colston, rented 3 weeks before Tobias Broach's death," Saul said. "Cash payment, quiet location on the Lower East Side." Wolfe took the paper, scanned it, and grunted. "What else?" "Ari Falcone has been in contact with both Broach and Malloy. Falcone received a large wire transfer 2 months ago from an offshore account, presumably linked to Malloy's holding company. Around the same time, the museum's trustees quietly approved the final acquisition papers for the Sibylline glass amphora. "And the artifact?" Wolfe asked. Saul shook his head. "Untraceable origin. Half the provenance paperwork is missing or forged. Broach was likely building a case." "And now," I added, "we know where he stored it." I was on that storage unit an hour later. It was the kind of place where every third door looked like it had hosted a crime scene. The manager took one look at Wolfe's letterhead and decided not to argue. Unit 16. B was small and clean, like Tobias's apartment had been, only more focused. Stacks of folders lined the walls, each labelled in neat script. A single folding table in the centre bore a file open and waiting. Tobias had left breadcrumbs and he'd used red string, not literally, but with the same clarity. I spent an hour cataloguing it all before calling Wolfe. The photographs alone told the story, side-by-side comparisons of the amphora's supposed original structure, and Tobias's notes outlining inconsistencies in the metal alloy, glass curvature, and oxidation levels. In layman's terms, it was a Frankenstein. In one folder was a series of fingerprint lifting experiments, notations involving resin, heat, and pressure. And at the bottom, a sample sealed in plastic, a faint, lifted print, too blurred to read. But the technique, reverse adhesion using antique Roman bonding agents, matched what Wolfe had already suspected. Tobias hadn't just predicted his death, he had prepared a mechanism by which it could speak in his absence. That evening, I spread the contents of the locker across Wolfe's desk, like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Wolfe, eyes narrowed, examined the photographs in sequence. One of the images, a close-up of the amphora's base, bore a maker's mark that had been chemically altered, then re-etched. A second photo showed a seam beneath the vessel's lip, where a Roman neck had been fused to a provincial body. "It's a mosaic," Wolfe said. "Of sorts," I agreed. "Glass from Syria, handles from northern Italy, base possibly Spanish." Tobias mapped it all. "And Malloy?" Wolfe asked. "There's more. Falcone's bank statements confirm he received a premium for expedited antiquities handling. The check originated from a Malloy shell account." Wolfe exhaled heavily. "So, Malloy funded the fraud, Broach uncovered it, and now Broach is dead." "Neatly timed," I said. "But not neatly done." Wolfe tapped the fingerprint photo. "Indeed not. The jar was meant as an object lesson. Mr. Broach lacked power in life, but not in death." "What now?" I asked. He sat back, folding his arms across his chest. "We continue." "But we have him." "No." Wolfe's voice dropped to a murmur. "We have a web, but the spider has yet to feel the tremble." For the next 24 hours, Wolfe refused to act. He read. He thought. He drank beer and ate sauerbraten and stared out the window like he expected Rome to rise from the sidewalk. I was pacing the office, ready to knock down doors, or at least rattle one or two, when Wolfe finally spoke. "Mr. Broach," he said, "was a conservator. He believed in the integrity of fragments, that even shattered things could be pieced together if one respected their truth." He turned to me. "There is one more thing we lack." "What's that?" Wolfe's voice was cool and precise. "Fear." I frowned. "From who?" "From the man who thinks he buried a secret," Wolfe said, "until he realizes the ghost of his victim is not silent." I blinked. "You're going to invite them all here?" "Of course," Wolfe said. "That is the only appropriate setting." He picked up the telephone. "If you think tea at Wolfe's is ever casual, you've never seen him set a trap." That morning, he had dictated 5 notes, each brief, elegant, and misleading. The tone was cordial, the purpose vague. To clarify legal implications surrounding the late Mr. Broach's estate. Saul delivered them by hand. By noon, the table in the office had been cleared of its usual clutter and replaced with a discreet tray. Fritz's finest Darjeeling, delicate porcelain cups, and a chilled plate of lemon tarts so innocent they were practically alibis. Wolfe had never once entertained guests over tea in the middle of a case. That was the point. He remained in his chair, of course, while I adjusted the spacing of chairs with the kind of flair that makes an undertaker blush. I assume this is the part where I play maitre d', psychologist, and armed guard, I asked. Yes, Wolfe replied, in that order. The first to respond was Dorian Clabb. His call came early, his voice soft and uncertain. Do I need an attorney? You are not accused of anything, I assured him. This is an information session. Right, he said. But what if I have none to offer? Then enjoy the tea. Next was Gloria Vance, firm, polished, curious. She accepted without hesitation, though I could hear the pause in her breath. Jared Malloy didn't bother calling. His secretary rang instead. Mr. Malloy will attend, she said curtly, though he questions the necessity. Mr. Wolfe does not host without necessity, I replied. And so by 4 o'clock our cast was confirmed. Wolfe remained as composed as ever, arching one eyebrow at me as I adjusted the final cup. Mr. Goodwin, he murmured, one does not bait a trap with noise. Then let's hope they're the squeaky kind, I said. By 4:15 they had all arrived, each carrying their own tension like luggage they didn't intend to unpack. Gloria Vance was first, as crisp and self-possessed as a press release. She greeted Wolfe with a smile so polished it could have doubled as silverware. Mr. Wolfe, she said, how gracious of you to include us. Wolfe inclined his head. Graciousness is unprofitable, Miss Vance. This is an inquiry. She arched a brow but said nothing further. Dorian Clabb came next, coat wrinkled and collar askew. His fingers twitched at his cuff as he nodded to me, avoiding everyone's eyes, especially Wolfe's. He sat quickly, like a schoolboy expecting a reprimand and hoping for invisibility. Then came Jared Malloy, fashionably late by 7 minutes and perfumed with cologne and contempt. His handshake was cool, his eyes sharp. He took the seat directly across from Wolfe and crossed his legs like a man used to favorable angles. I trust this will be brief, he said, settling in. I have trustees breathing down my neck and a dinner with the governor's assistant. Wolfe didn't blink. Perhaps I will provide you something to chew on. Malloy's smile didn't reach his eyes. I doubt that. As Fritz poured the tea, I studied the players. Gloria watched everyone with the keen detachment of a woman used to making decisions in boardrooms full of men. Dorian's gaze shifted from object to object, the vase in the corner, the tea tray, the edge of the carpet, anywhere but the jar on Wolfe's desk. Malloy reclined with a kind of practiced arrogance you only learn in after avoiding consequences for most of your adult life. Wolfe took a slow sip of tea and placed the cup down with precision. Then he cleared his throat once, a sound that served as curtain and cue. Thank you all for coming, he said, though I imagine you would have preferred not to. They all stared at him. Wolfe, for his part, appeared indifferent to the weight of their gazes. That, I knew, was deliberate. Wolfe's indifference was never genuine, it was tactical. You are here, he began, because a man is dead, and his death, though ruled accidental, is not. Mr. Tobias Broach, conservator of antiquities and reluctant custodian of secrets, was murdered. There was a silence so sharp it could have sliced through porcelain. Malloy shifted. Is this official? He asked. No, Wolfe said evenly. It is factual. Gloria's fingers curled around her cup. I don't see what any of us... Wolfe raised a hand. You will. Permit me to reconstruct what occurred. He leaned back, hands folded, eyes narrowing. Mr. Broach worked closely on the restoration of a certain Roman amphora, an acquisition celebrated by this city's cultural elite. However, the object was not what it claimed to be. Its base, neck, and embellishments originated from 3 different regions, forged together with skill but not integrity. Dorian paled. I noted the flicker and filed it. Wolfe continued. Tobias Broach discovered this. Whether he initially intended to expose it is unclear. What is clear is that he documented every inconsistency with the precision of a man who anticipated resistance, and then he vanished, from the museum, from his routine, retreating to the safety of isolation. Or so he thought. Wolfe's gaze shifted to Malloy, then back to the center of the room. But secrets have weight, and the man funding that artifact's acquisition, perhaps to launder reputation, or simply to purchase prestige, could not afford exposure. Malloy's smile returned, this time thinner. "You're suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Wolfe interrupted. "I report." He tapped the jam jar with a single finger. "What is most compelling is this. The jar was not Tobias's. He did not eat jam. He was, however, an expert in glass." Wolfe's voice softened. "That jar contains a bloody fingerprint inside. The seal is intact, impossible unless it was planted, unless the print was embedded, not spilled." Gloria spoke, her voice quiet. "He wanted to accuse someone." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Posthumously. Mr. Broach expected to die and made arrangements so that his death would contain a puzzle." He looked at Dorian. "He also told someone he had prepared something." Dorian swallowed but said nothing. Wolfe leaned forward. "That something was not revenge, it was justice, executed through intellect, not rage." Then he glanced at me and murmured, "And now, we shall see whose conscience feels the heat." There was a pause, the kind that either ends in applause or a shooting. In this case, it ended with Jared Malloy leaning forward, all pretense dropped. "This is outrageous," he said, voice tight. "You insinuate that I, a patron of the arts and contributor to this city's cultural lifeblood, am what? An accomplice to fraud? A murderer?" Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "You said that, I did not." "I don't need to be insulted by a man who never leaves his chair." "No," Wolfe said, "but you will be interrogated by one." Gloria Vance intervened smoothly. "Mr. Wolfe, I must point out that this entire gathering walks a very fine line. I attended out of courtesy. If you have legal concerns about the amphora, I suggest you take it up with the board." Wolfe didn't look at her. "Your board," he said calmly, "was misled by forged provenance, constructed to benefit certain reputations and balance sheets. Your courtesy is not in question. Your discernment is." Gloria smiled, tight-lipped. "I'm not an archaeologist. I trust my staff." "Perhaps unwisely?" Dorian Clabb let out a nervous cough. He had been doing his best impression of a lamp, but Wolfe turned his head, and Clabb practically shrank into his chair. "You were present when Mr. Broach examined the artifact," Wolfe said. Dorian nodded once. "You knew it was inauthentic?" Dorian hesitated. Then, "I suspected. But Tobias wouldn't let me see all his notes. He said it wasn't safe. And when he died, I didn't know what to do. If I said anything, it would have implicated the museum. I thought maybe he was wrong." "You knew he wasn't," Wolfe said. Clabb swallowed and looked at the floor. "Number I knew." Malloy laughed mirthlessly. "So now the frightened assistant is the reliable witness." "No," Wolfe said. "Now the frightened assistant is the weight your alibi can no longer carry." Wolfe waited until the tension ripened, like fruit left out on a summer windowsill. Then, without fanfare, he reached to his desk and produced another jar, identical in shape and label, to the one brought by Miriam. "I offer you a twin," he said. "This jar is sealed, intact, and yet—" He turned it gently under the light. "Inside you will see a fingerprint, visible, red-tinted." Malloy stared at it with narrowed eyes. Gloria leaned in slightly. Dorian looked ready to faint. Wolfe continued. "This was not printed in blood nor placed by hand. It was embedded deliberately, using a method consistent with ancient Roman resin techniques." Clabb spoke in a whisper. "That's what Tobias was testing. He said it was his message in a bottle." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Mr. Broach, faced with a threat he could neither escape nor openly accuse, chose to leave behind a message encoded in the language he knew best, glass." He gestured toward the jar. "The fingerprint within the original jar recovered from Mr. Broach's apartment matches, Mr. Malloy. The seal, untouched, makes any casual explanation of physical contact impossible. It is not a trace, it is a trap." Malloy chuckled, a bit too loudly. A jar proves nothing. It could be fabricated, lifted from a glass at dinner. You said so yourself. It was embedded. Wolfe did not smile. Yes, lifted. From where? That stopped him. Wolfe pressed on. Tobias knew your habits, your haunts. He likely lifted a clean fingerprint from a glass, possibly at a museum function, then used a bonding agent derived from Roman amphorae resin to embed it in the jar from within. The blood, possibly animal, was cosmetic. The real point was the impossible positioning. Malloy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man you visited that night, perhaps to intimidate, perhaps to bargain, was ready. He had laid the trap before you even entered. He knew you would kill him. That's absurd, Malloy said hoarsely. No, Wolfe said, voice as calm as falling snow. It's tragic. Tobias Broach did not fight back. He simply outthought you. Malloy stood abruptly, knocking over his teacup. You can't prove I killed him. No, Wolfe said, but Tobias already has. For a moment, no one spoke. Malloy hovered, fists clenched at his sides. Dorian was staring at the second jar like it might detonate. Gloria's lips pressed together as if to contain something, an objection or a confession, or both. Wolfe remained seated, serene as a stone Buddha. He knew he was in danger, Wolfe said quietly, and he knew he would not survive it. But Tobias Broach was not interested in vengeance. He was interested in truth. He gestured to the jar. That is not evidence. It is testimony, a final gesture from a man who had nothing left to lose but his dignity. Miriam Broach, who had sat silently throughout the proceedings, finally lifted her head. He told me once that truth always left a residue, that even after people tried to scrub it away, something would remain. Wolfe gave a slow nod. It has. Malloy looked at her, then at the jar. You think this changes anything? You think anyone will believe some dead man's science project over me? Wolfe's voice dropped an octave. No, Mr. Malloy, I do not rely on belief. I rely on facts. Malloy turned to leave, but Wolfe raised a finger. There is still one more piece, he said. A corroboration, a statement you did not expect, because you believed you had silenced every voice. But Tobias was not the only one who prepared. I moved toward the hall as Wolfe said it. The final chord was already tuned. The door opened, and Saul Panzer stepped in, holding a small envelope in one hand and his ever-neutral expression on his face. Wolfe gave him a single nod. Proceed. Saul handed me the envelope, and I extracted a transcribed voicemail. He'd had it authenticated by 2 separate labs. I read it aloud. This is Tobias Broach. The jar's ready. If anything happens to me, look inside. You'll see who visited. You'll see what I couldn't say. The timestamp was 23 minutes before Tobias's estimated time of death. Malloy sat down hard. The recording was recovered from the voicemail of one Ari Falcone, Saul said. Tobias left it after your visit began. Falcone deleted it the next day. We retrieved it through his telecom provider. Wolfe addressed the room. It is over. The fingerprint, the storage unit, the documentation of fraud, the money trail, and now the voice of the victim himself. He turned to Malloy. You may, of course, dispute this in court, but it will avail you nothing. The pieces have already settled into place. Gloria Vance rose. I had no part in this, she said quietly. I will resign, effective immediately. Dorian sat frozen, not in guilt, but in something closer to relief. Wolfe leaned back, reached for his glass and said nothing more. For him, the case was complete. The jar had been opened. The truth, preserved within, had spoken. The room, still thick with Wolfe's declaration, had settled into an uneasy hush. Malloy's chair creaked as he adjusted his posture, not defensive yet, but no longer at ease. Gloria Vance sat upright with the dignity of someone whose mind was already drafting a statement for the press. Dorian Clabb fidgeted with his sleeve cuff as though it might unravel something less visible inside him. And Wolfe, well, Wolfe was quiet. Not the silence of indecision, but of orchestration. The the maestro pausing before the final movement. "I do not conduct trials," he said finally, "nor do I presume to render judgment, but I do deal in fact and in patterns. When a pattern begins with fraud and ends in death, it is worth our attention." He shifted in his chair slightly and continued, "And Mr. Broach, by all accounts, was exacting, a man of lonely habits and deep thought, devoted to the preservation of truth, whether in glass or in history. That made him inconvenient, especially for those who preferred reputation to reality." Wolfe turned his gaze deliberately toward Malloy, who met it with a defiant stillness. "The jam jar," Wolfe said, "was not a clever touch. It was a calculated expression. A final exhibit by a man whose hands were trained to restore, but who used them in the end to indict." Still no reply from Malloy. "Tobias Broach died not because he confronted you, Mr. Malloy, but because he refused to disappear, and what he left behind, this absurdly domestic object, bearing the print of a man who had no earthly reason to be there, was his final restoration, not of glass, but of truth. Archie Goodwin, that's me, doesn't often admit to goosebumps unless there's a draft, but Wolfe had set the tone like a tuning fork. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was structural. You could feel it shifting beneath your feet. Malloy said nothing, but his silence had changed. It was no longer disdain, it was calculation, and Wolfe, without altering tone, volume, or position, tightened the psychological noose. Malloy shifted again, less subtly this time. "I never touched that jar," he said finally, his voice low. "And I certainly didn't kill Tobias Broach. I went to speak with him. That's all." Wolfe nodded once. "When?" Malloy straightened. "About 10 o'clock. We argued. He was irrational. I left." "Alive?" Wolfe asked mildly. "Yes," Malloy snapped. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment and sighed, patiently, as one might before correcting a child. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "will you produce the document?" I retrieved it from the side drawer, a copy of the city's parking enforcement record for that evening. "Mr. Malloy's car," I said, "was ticketed at 12:07 a.m. on Bleecker, 2 blocks from Mr. Broach's apartment." Malloy blinked. "That means nothing." "No?" Wolfe's tone was unhurried. "You claim to have left Mr. Broach's apartment around 10. Were you parked there 2 hours later for sentimental reasons?" "I may have returned," Malloy said, floundering. He wasn't answering his phone. "I wanted to follow up." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "A follow-up." He opened his eyes and locked them on Malloy. "So you returned? And upon finding him unresponsive, you left?" "Yes," Malloy said, too quickly. "Without contacting police? Without informing anyone?" Malloy hesitated. "You see," Wolfe said, "your defense lies not in what you admit, but in what you omit. You claim to have visited, argued, and left, but the evidence, parking ticket, timeline, fingerprint, places you there at a moment Tobias Broach could no longer speak for himself." Malloy's breath caught. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Fortunately for him, Mr. Broach arranged for someone else to speak in his place." The door opened a crack, and Saul Panzer stepped in, as precise and silent as ever. In his hand was a slim recording device and a notarized transcript. Wolfe didn't need to ask. He simply gestured. Saul set the recorder on the table and pressed play. A voice filled the room, crackled slightly by distance, but unmistakably clear. Male, educated, flat with resignation. "This is Tobias Broach. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it. I've sealed the jar, the fingerprints inside. It belongs to Jared Malloy. I lifted it from a teacup at the donor gala. I know what he did. I know why. Someone needs to understand what happened." The message ended. No drama, no epilogue, just silence. I glanced at Malloy. His complexion had paled to the color of an undercooked scone. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Wolfe with something that might have been the ghost of fear. "That recording," Wolfe said quietly, "was recovered from the voicemail system of one Ari Falcone. Mr. Broach left it at 11:41 p.m., 26 minutes before your alleged departure. He turned to Saul. The recording was authenticated? Twice, Saul replied. Time-stamped and logged by the telecom company. Falcone deleted it. We retrieved it from the server. Wolfe turned back to Malloy. You have now been accused by print, by motive, by timeline, and by voice. Malloy exhaled, but there was no wind behind it. And if you insist on protesting your innocence, Wolfe said, I suggest you do so in the company of your counsel. Mr. Goodwin will gladly call them for you. Malloy didn't reply. Wolfe's voice was steady, cool, final. Tobias Broach has spoken. That, Mr. Malloy, is the last testimony you'll be able to silence. Malloy didn't crumble. That would have been too easy and entirely out of character. What he did instead was lean back, adjust his cufflinks, and offer a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Let's say I was there, he said, voice tight. Let's say we argued. Let's say I lost my temper. That still doesn't mean I killed him. No, Wolfe said evenly. It means he outmaneuvered you. Malloy's brow furrowed. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Tobias Broach understood three things with perfect clarity, Wolfe continued. First, that you had motive to protect a fraudulent acquisition. Second, that you had access, having already visited him, possibly under the guise of persuasion. And third, most tragically, that your pride would not tolerate exposure. Wolfe turned slightly, directing his words to the group but keeping Malloy in focus. He did not accuse you directly. He constructed a situation, carefully, coldly, designed to provoke a single, fatal error. I nodded. The jar wasn't left in a drawer, it was placed in plain view, as if daring the killer to ignore it. Precisely, Wolfe said. Mr. Broach understood psychology as well as glasswork. He knew that guilt, once threatened, turns reckless. You saw the jar. Perhaps you opened it. Perhaps you merely saw it and panicked. But either way, he had baited the hook and you bit. Malloy scoffed, but the air had gone out of the room. Why wouldn't he call the police? Malloy asked. Because, Wolfe said quietly, he believed they would not protect him in time. So instead, he turned his own death into an argument no living man could refute. Saul, from the corner, added in his usual mild tone, smartest dead man I ever worked for. Malloy tried to recover his balance. If that's true, it was entrapment. Wolfe allowed himself the faintest smile. No, Mr. Malloy, it was prophecy. It would have been satisfying, in a melodramatic way, to watch Malloy fall apart with weeping and hand-wringing, but real collapses, intellectual ones, are quieter, slower. They happen behind the eyes, one filament at a time. Malloy sat straighter, but the pose had no spine. His hands, which had so often punctuated his speech with confident circular gestures, now rested flat on the table. Even his voice changed, less baritone, more brittle. So what now? He asked, almost as if addressing no one. You call the press? Parade me through a scandal? Wolfe didn't answer. He simply waited, eyes fixed, allowing the silence to devour the man across from him. Gloria Vance, who had remained a statue for most of the afternoon, finally exhaled. You funded the acquisition, she said softly. You wanted your name tied to something that would outlive you. Instead, you got this. Malloy glanced at her as if surprised she was still present. You benefited too. I was deceived, she said. Tobias tried to tell me. I didn't listen. Malloy looked down. Neither did I. Wolfe's voice, when it came again, was not harsh. It was absolute. You were not deceived. You were warned. And you dismissed him. He leaned forward just slightly. Mr. Broach constructed a puzzle not to trap you, but to elevate the truth. That you find yourself beneath it is incidental. Malloy didn't reply. He didn't need to. I've seen men hauled out by police before. I've seen them sweat, shout, deny. Malloy just sat there, hollowed out, like the vessel he tried to pass off as whole. Wolfe gave me a glance. That was my cue to call Inspector Kramer. After Malloy was escorted out, without handcuffs but not without weight, Miriam Broach remained seated in the corner of Wolfe's office. Her posture had not changed much since the beginning, except now there was a softness in her shoulders, like some long-tensed cord had finally slackened. She didn't weep immediately. Not the noisy kind, anyway. Just sat there, one hand on her lap, the other brushing lightly over the empty jar Wolfe had placed on the desk. "He never believed people would understand him," she said. "He said truth was too delicate, like blown glass, pretty when whole, worthless when cracked." Wolfe studied her but said nothing. I approached her quietly. He understood more than he thought. He knew how to leave a trail that couldn't be swept away. She smiled faintly. He would have liked that. Then she looked at Wolfe. "Thank you," she said, softly but clearly. "For listening. For believing a jar of jam was more than it seemed." Wolfe gave a small incline of the head. "It was not belief, Miss Broach. It was logic." She stood to leave, and as Fritz guided her gently to the door, she turned back one last time and said, "He didn't die in vain." "No," Wolfe said. "He died as he lived, preserving what others might have thrown away." Dinner that evening was unusually quiet. Fritz, sensing something sacred had passed through the walls of the brownstone, refrained from his usual commentary on the veal's perfection. The plates were cleared efficiently, the sauces subtle, and the wine, German, dry and cold, poured without request. Wolfe, back in his natural habitat at the dining table, had not spoken of the case since Malloy's reluctant exit. He had eaten well, but with a kind of mechanical grace, as though his appetite, while present, had been tempered by contemplation. Only once dessert had been cleared and coffee poured did he speak. "There is," he said, "a peculiar satisfaction in witnessing the architecture of another man's mind, particularly when it continues to function beyond his death." I stirred my coffee. "You mean Tobias?" "Of course I mean Tobias," Wolfe said. His thinking was not merely deductive, it was poetic. The jar, the print, the timing. It was not revenge, it was an epilogue. "You're getting sentimental," he sniffed. "Sentiment is distasteful, but craftsmanship deserves recognition." He reached for a small plate of rye toast, sliced with Fritz's customary symmetry, and added, "And legacy, Mr. Goodwin, is not always built in life. Sometimes it is sculpted in silence, left to be unearthed." I leaned back. "So we've crossed from orchids to philosophy." "It is not a large leap," he murmured. "Both require cultivation, both wilt under neglect." He buttered his toast with the same deliberation he applied to his cross-examinations and added, "Mr. Broach has achieved a kind of immortality. His story, his truth, will endure. That is more than most obtain." "You're saying the murder was worth it?" "No," Wolfe said firmly, "but the result is not unworthy of reflection." And in that rare moment I realized Wolfe wasn't gloating. He was admiring. Not the crime, but the clarity. Not the death, but the design. Fritz returned with the preserves, a small jar of apricot jam, unopened, glinting slightly in the soft kitchen light. Wolfe took it with care, broke the seal with his thumbs, and spread a modest layer onto the toast with all the ceremonial gravity of a priest handling relics. "Apricot," he said quietly. "Not blackberry?" I smirked. "Safer too, no forensic flourishes." Wolfe didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes creased faintly. There are instances when silence is preferable to spectacle. He took a bite, chewed slowly, then placed the toast back on the plate with exactness. "Jam," he said, "is at its essence preservation. Not merely of fruit, but of memory. A method of defying decay." "Now you sound like a eulogy." "No," he replied, "a conclusion." I let the words settle. Wolfe rarely indulged metaphor unless he meant it. And here the implication was as rich as the jam. Tobias had preserved the truth as one might a harvest, in sugar, sealed, and waiting for the right moment to be opened. He took another sip of coffee and said no more. Back in the office later, I stood by the windowsill, watching the traffic ease its way up 9th Avenue. Wolfe remained seated at his desk, eyes closed, lips barely parted, not in sleep, but in a state I could only describe as digestion, mental and physical. "You know," I said, "this whole thing started with a jar of jam and a nervous woman. I didn't think it would end with a philosophical victory lap." Wolfe's eyes remained closed. I continued, "I've dealt with killers who used guns, poison, rope, and piano wire, but never one who unraveled himself because a dead man snuck his fingerprint into a breakfast condiment." Still nothing. "So," I said, "what do we call that? Justice in a jelly jar?" One of Wolfe's eyebrows twitched, barely. "I mean," I added, "it's sticky but satisfying." At last, Wolfe opened one eye, gave me a look that conveyed both weariness and faint approval, and offered a single, definitive grunt. That, for Wolfe, was equivalent to a standing ovation. I smiled, turned back to the window, and made a mental note to buy apricot jam the next time I went shopping, just in case we ever needed to preserve something important. Something like the truth. Wolfe took a final sip of coffee, set the cup down, and stared at the now empty jam jar on the desk. His eyes, half-lidded with thought, held no triumph, only a cool, abiding clarity. "Mr. Broach," he said, more to the air than to me, "was not a man of confrontation. He was a man of construction. His final act, quiet, deliberate, and entirely bloodless, proved more effective than 100 accusations." I raised an eyebrow. "So what are we supposed to take from it? That it's better to set a trap than fight back?" "No," Wolfe said, tapping the rim of the jar with one thick finger. "That the most enduring truth is the one preserved, not shouted. That intellect, when cornered, still has teeth." I leaned against the filing cabinet, thoughtful. "If I ever die holding a jar of jam, I hope someone reads it right." Wolfe closed his eyes again. "That depends, Mr. Goodwin, on whether you've written the message clearly enough." Tobias Broach planned every step, every fingerprint, every sealed message, but he never lived to see it unfold. What do you think was Jared Malloy's biggest mistake? Trusting his power or underestimating Tobias's silence? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your theory. If you enjoyed unraveling this Nero Wolfe mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more cases built on sharp minds and sharper dialogue. Like the video, share it with a fellow mystery lover, and drop your thoughts below. There's always more than meets the eye, and the next jar might be waiting.